People will queue for anything. But back in the 60s, these 25 freshly baked favorites were worth every second in line. From timeless pies to legendary pastries, this golden era served up treats so irresistible that people queued up before sunrise to get their hands on them. Imagine a dessert that practically steals the show. An ice cream cake topped with fluffy meringue then set aflame. That was the Baked Alaska, a true showstopper in the 1960s, often making appearances at extravagant dinner parties and special celebrations. This dramatic dessert has roots dating back to the 19th century, but it reached its peak popularity in mid-20th century America, where it became synonymous with luxury and indulgence. A recipe that screamed special occasion, Baked Alaska quickly became the go-to treat for birthdays, anniversaries, and even New Year's Eve parties. In its simplest form, the dish consists of a layer of sponge cake, followed by a generous scoop of ice cream, all encased in a thick layer of meringue. The whole thing is then baked in a hot oven for just a few minutes, enough to crisp the meringue without melting the ice cream inside. The result was a perfect combination of warm, crisp, and cold, all wrapped up in a theatrical presentation. Back in the 60s, Baked Alaska was often flambéed at the table, adding an extra dash of drama. Today's version may lack the theatrics, but the flavors remain timeless. After World War II, the world of pastries saw a resurgence, and one treat that quickly became a favorite was the delicate chocolate eclair. With its origins tracing back to 19th century France, this pastry became an emblem of post-war indulgence in America. Light, crisp, and filled with rich custard cream, the eclair was the perfect balance of luxury and simplicity, something everyone could enjoy, whether at an afternoon tea or a celebratory event. The key to a classic eclair lies in its choux pastry, which puffs up during baking to create a hollow center, ideal for filling with creamy custard or whipped cream. A glossy layer of chocolate icing tops it all off, adding just the right amount of sweetness. In the 1960s, these pastries were often served at elegant gatherings, where their delicate nature and decadent flavor made them a hit. Today, we might find eclairs in more varied flavors like coffee or fruit, but the traditional chocolate-filled version remains a favorite. Did you know that the word éclair comes from the French word for flash, referencing the speed with which these pastries are devoured? And while they've evolved, the joy of biting into an eclair with its perfect blend of cream and pastry is a timeless treat that still has us hooked. In the 1960s, there was one pastry that people simply couldn't resist: sticky buns. These sweet, gooey delights quickly became a staple in American bakeries, their rich caramel and nut topping making them an instant classic. While the sticky buns' roots stretch back to the 18th century, it was in the post-war era that this treat truly became a sensation, rising in popularity alongside other indulgent desserts. Made from a yeasted dough similar to cinnamon rolls, sticky buns are baked in a sweet syrup made from butter, brown sugar, and corn syrup, which creates that signature sticky, caramelized finish. Chopped pecans or walnuts often top the buns, adding a crunchy contrast to the gooey sweetness below. The combination of rich, melt-in-your-mouth caramel and soft dough made these treats a breakfast favorite, though it wasn't unusual to see them enjoyed at any time of day. By today's standards, the version we enjoy may have fewer nuts or a less syrupy topping, but the core of the sticky bun remains the same. In the 1960s, these were often sold in bakeries, the warm smell filling the streets, adding to their nostalgic appeal. Today, pre-made sticky buns can be found in almost any bakery or grocery store, but the irresistible allure of that caramelized topping keeps them a beloved treat, no matter the decade. If there's one pastry that's become synonymous with celebration, it's the jelly donut. While the history of filled pastries goes back centuries, the jelly donut, especially popular in the 1960s, became a holiday favorite, often served at family gatherings or special occasions. This treat gained traction in America around the mid-20th century, becoming a go-to indulgence during festive seasons like Hanukkah and even New Year's. A soft, yeast-based dough is fried to golden perfection, then injected with a generous filling of sweet jelly, usually raspberry or strawberry. A light dusting of powdered sugar completes the look. Simple, yet incredibly satisfying, jelly donuts became a favorite for their combination of rich, warm dough and the burst of fruit filling in every bite. In the 1960s, jelly donuts were often made at home or purchased fresh from local bakeries, making them a nostalgic treat that took a bit of effort and care. Today, while you can find them in almost every donut shop, with an endless variety of fillings and toppings, it's the classic combination of sugar and fruit jelly that remains the most nostalgic. Rich, nutty, and oh so decadent, pecan pie became a true star of American holiday tables in the 1960s. While the origins of the pie trace back to the southern United States, it was during the mid-20th century that it really gained widespread popularity. By the 60s, it had become an essential part of family gatherings, especially during Thanksgiving and Christmas. A classic pecan pie starts with a buttery pie crust, filled with a mixture of corn syrup, brown sugar, butter, and eggs, all topped off with a generous layer of pecans. When baked, the filling becomes rich and gooey, while the pecans add a crunchy texture that perfectly complements the sweetness of the filling. Today, while you can still find the same traditional recipe, many versions use pre-made crusts or even tweak the filling with ingredients like maple syrup or chocolate. Still, the nostalgic appeal of a slice of pecan pie is hard to beat. Fun fact: pecan pie became even more beloved after World War II, when pecans, once a rare treat, became more widely available in grocery stores across the country. There's something about a warm, fruity dessert that makes you feel right at home, and few desserts are as comforting as peach cobbler. Originating in the southern United States, peach cobbler is a testament to the tradition of showcasing seasonal fruits, but by the 1960s, it had become a beloved treat enjoyed nationwide. In fact, it quickly became the dessert of choice when peaches were in season, often served at summer barbecues and family gatherings. The recipe is simple, but the flavors are anything but. Ripe, juicy peaches are mixed with sugar and a touch of cinnamon, then topped with a biscuit-like dough that bakes into a golden, flaky crust. The result is a sweet, slightly tangy filling beneath a crisp topping, making it the perfect balance of textures. In the 1960s, peach cobbler was often made with fresh or canned peaches, and many cooks relied on their own tried-and-true methods to prepare it. Today, while fresh peaches are still the preferred choice, frozen or canned versions make it more convenient for busy families. And let's not forget the modern twist of adding a scoop of ice cream or whipped cream on top, a nice nod to the nostalgia of this all-American classic. In the vibrant, bold era of the 1960s, layer cakes were a celebration of color and creativity. Reflecting the lively, experimental spirit of the decade, these cakes often featured multiple layers of cake and frosting in bright, eye-catching hues. It was about making a statement, whether for a birthday, a family gathering, or just because these multi-layered cakes were the epitome of fun and festivity. Traditionally made with simple ingredients like flour, sugar, eggs, and butter, the cake was often flavored with vanilla or chocolate. But it was the frosting that stole the show. Bold colors, thanks to artificial food dyes, created cakes that were as visually stunning as they were delicious. For many bakers, frosting wasn't just something to spread on the cake, it was a canvas for creativity, with flowers, designs, and even piping techniques that reflected the era's playful aesthetic. The 1960s saw the rise of boxed cake mixes, making the process easier for busy families, though we can all agree that nothing beats the satisfaction of a homemade creation. Today, while pre-made cakes and frosting might be more common, many still love the nostalgic feel of a homemade layer cake. In the 1960s, muffins began to solidify their place as a beloved breakfast staple, offering a versatile alternative to the traditional toast and eggs. Though muffins had been around for centuries, the 60s saw them gain new prominence, especially with the rise of convenience foods and changing eating habits. These fluffy treats came in both savory and sweet varieties, making them the perfect option for busy mornings or quick snacks. Made with simple ingredients like flour, sugar, eggs, milk, and baking powder, muffins are incredibly easy to whip up. The basic batter could be transformed into a multitude of flavors, from sweet blueberry or banana nut to savory cheese and herb varieties. Many bakers at the time began experimenting with different mix-ins, turning muffins into a personal creation. The 1960s saw an explosion of muffin recipes, with home cooks and bakeries alike embracing this easy, portable breakfast. Today's muffin scene has evolved to include everything from gluten-free options to more decadent, indulgent varieties like double chocolate or pumpkin spice. While they still carry that same nostalgia, the 60s version often had a simpler, homier feel, made with pantry staples and no fancy add-ins. There's something undeniably comforting about the warm aroma of cinnamon rolls filling a home, and in the 1960s, these sweet, spiced treats became a breakfast and dessert favorite across America. Though cinnamon rolls have roots in Swedish baking traditions, their popularity exploded in the US in the mid-20th century, thanks in part to the rise of home baking and the growing accessibility of ingredients like cinnamon and sugar. Made from a soft, yeasted dough, cinnamon rolls are rolled up with a rich mixture of cinnamon, sugar, and butter, then sliced into individual portions and baked to golden perfection. The final touch is a glaze, often made from powdered sugar and milk, drizzled over the top for that iconic sweetness. These rolls were often served fresh out of the oven, making them an ideal treat for chilly mornings. In the 1960s, cinnamon rolls were commonly made from scratch, with friends gathering to line up at bakeries. Today, many opt for pre-made dough or even frozen versions, making them more convenient, but the nostalgia of the 1960s cinnamon roll still remains strong. In the 1960s, as Americans became more health-conscious and sought lighter desserts, one pie stood out as the perfect balance of tart and sweet: lemon meringue pie. With its refreshing citrus filling, fluffy meringue topping, and crisp pie crust, it fit right in with the era's desire for lighter, yet indulgent, treats. Though the pie's origins can be traced back to 19th century Europe, it found a new home in American bakeries, where it became a favorite during spring and summer gatherings. The filling of a lemon meringue pie consists of lemon juice, sugar, cornstarch, and egg yolks, cooked to a smooth consistency before being poured into a golden pie crust. The meringue, whipped egg whites, and sugar then crowns the pie, baked until golden brown. In the 1960s, many bakers took pride in making the meringue from scratch, with the delicate texture being a hallmark of the pie's charm. Today, the version we enjoy may come with shortcuts, like pre-made crusts and even store-bought meringue. But the essence of lemon meringue remains the same. The sharp lemon flavor of the pie made it the perfect contrast to the richness of other desserts, and its lighter feel made it a popular choice in the health-conscious era. Apple pie has long been regarded as the quintessential American dessert, and by the 1960s, it was a staple in bakeries across the country. Though its roots date back to colonial times, the 60s saw it firmly entrenched as a symbol of American baking. The popularity of apple pie during this time was about tradition, with many families considering it a must-have for family dinners, picnics, and holidays. The recipe is simple, yet timeless. Tart apples, sugar, cinnamon, and butter, all encased in a flaky, buttery crust. In the 1960s, many bakers made their apple pies from scratch, using apples like Granny Smith or McIntosh, which were available at local orchards. The result was a comforting dessert that combined the sweetness of the apples with a warm, spiced filling. Today's version of apple pie may include variations like lattice crusts or pre-made fillings, but the essence remains the same. One difference from the 1960s, the modern rise of health-conscious baking, where you'll sometimes find recipes calling for less sugar or alternative sweeteners. The term "as American as apple pie" became so ingrained in the 20th century that it's practically shorthand for American values, family, tradition, and a whole lot of sweetness. By the 1960s, brownies were everywhere, from bake sales to after-school snacks, and they quickly became an American baking staple. Their invention traces back to the late 19th century, but by the 60s, these chocolatey squares had solidified their place in American kitchens and bakeries. With their dense, fudgy texture and rich flavor, brownies were loved for both their convenience and indulgence. Unlike cakes, which require layering and frosting, Brownies were easy to bake and even easier to eat. A basic brownie recipe includes ingredients like sugar, butter, eggs, flour, and, of course, cocoa powder. But it's the balance of these that makes the texture so addictive. Some versions in the 60s were simple, with a slight crumb, while others leaned into the gooey, fudge-like consistency. Nuts were often added, though they were optional. Brownie mixes, introduced in the 1950s, took off in the 60s, making it even easier to bake a batch of these indulgent treats. Today, brownies come in countless variations, from low-fat to gourmet versions with exotic ingredients like sea salt and caramel swirls. While the basic formula remains unchanged, today's brownies are sometimes bigger and bolder, with more luxurious twists. Carrot cake unexpectedly gained popularity in the 1960s, combining the wholesome goodness of vegetables with the rich indulgence of a dessert. Though recipes for carrot-based cakes have been around for centuries, it wasn't until the 60s that it became a mainstream favorite, especially thanks to its rich, spiced flavor and the luscious cream cheese frosting that crowned it. The trend fit perfectly with the growing interest in healthier eating during the era, as people began looking for ways to add vegetables into their diets without giving up their sweet tooth. At its core, carrot cake is made from ingredients like flour, sugar, eggs, and of course grated carrots. Spices such as cinnamon and nutmeg give it that signature warmth, while nuts, often walnuts or pecans, add texture. The cake is topped with a tangy cream cheese frosting, which has become a hallmark of this treat. Today, you might find carrot cake with additional twists, perhaps pineapple for extra moisture or even vegan versions, but the 1960s version was more straightforward, with minimal additions. The popularity of carrot cake soared after it was featured in magazines like Better Homes and Gardens, helping it become a beloved dessert for special occasions and holiday meals. In the 1960s, banana bread became a go-to solution for overripe bananas, turning what could have been wasted fruit into a moist, comforting treat. The concept of using bananas in baked goods isn't new, but by the mid-20th century, banana bread became a staple in American bakeries. Its popularity grew because it was easy to make, used simple ingredients, and was a delicious way to make the most out of overripe bananas that might otherwise be tossed aside. Basic ingredients like flour, sugar, eggs, and of course, mashed bananas come together to create a loaf that's sweet and moist. Some recipes included added spices like cinnamon or nutmeg, and it was common to toss in chopped nuts, particularly walnuts, for added texture. The batter is poured into a loaf pan and baked until golden and fragrant, a nostalgic scent that filled streets across the country. Today, the recipe for banana bread has evolved in some ways. Health-conscious bakers might use whole wheat flour, low-sugar alternatives, or even gluten-free options. But the heart of the recipe remains the same. The 1960s version was often made with classic ingredients and served as a hearty breakfast or afternoon snack. Fried, sweet, and irresistibly fluffy, donuts have long been a beloved treat. But by the 1960s, they reached a new level of popularity, thanks in part to the rise of iconic chains like Dunkin' Donuts. While donuts had been around for centuries, gaining prominence in the U.S. in the late 19th century, the post-war boom saw them become a breakfast and snack time staple. The 60s introduced a more mass-market version, with convenience and consistency at its core. The basic donut is made from a simple dough of flour, sugar, eggs, and yeast, deep-fried until golden, and then often coated in sugar or glazed with a sweet icing. The dough can be shaped into rings or various other forms, depending on personal or regional preferences. The introduction of donut shops and franchises like Dunkin' Donuts made it easier for busy families to grab a donut on the go. Today's donuts might include extravagant toppings, fillings, or even fancy artisan variations, but the 60s version was all about simple, classic flavors: chocolate glazed, powdered sugar, or cinnamon. Elegant yet simple cream puffs have been delighting dessert lovers for centuries, but in the 1960s, they took on a special appeal. These delicate pastries, with their light, airy texture and luxurious filling, were seen as a bit of a treat for special occasions. Think dinner parties or holiday gatherings, but not so extravagant that they couldn't be enjoyed casually. Cream puffs are made from pâte à choux, a type of dough that puffs up when baked, creating a hollow center perfect for filling. The filling was typically either a rich, velvety custard or a sweetened whipped cream. The 1960s version was often simple, just a sprinkle of powdered sugar on top or a drizzle of chocolate to add a touch of flair. These pastries were small enough to feel fancy, but they didn't demand the attention of fancier desserts like baked Alaska or layered cakes. Today, cream puffs can come with all kinds of modern twists, flavored fillings, elaborate toppings, or even mini versions for easier serving. In the 60s, though, the charm was in their simplicity. They weren't flashy, but they made a statement. Cream puffs were often found at French-inspired bakeries, adding a touch of European sophistication to American dessert tables. By the 1960s, croissants, those buttery, flaky, crescent-shaped delights, began to make a major appearance in American bakeries, signaling the growing international influence on American baking. Though croissants are originally French, the post-war era saw them becoming more mainstream in the United States, thanks to the wave of European culinary trends that made their way across the Atlantic. Made from puff pastry, croissants require a delicate process of folding butter into dough multiple times to create their signature flaky layers. In the 1960s, croissants were often enjoyed at breakfast or as part of a refined brunch, sometimes filled with ham and cheese or served with a touch of jam. Croissants gained popularity in the U.S. thanks to French bakeries and new food trends, with many Americans discovering them for the first time while traveling abroad. Their airy, melt-in-your-mouth texture was a world away from traditional American pastries, and they quickly became synonymous with sophistication. Today, croissants come in countless varieties, chocolate-filled, almond-flavored, and even stuffed with savory fillings like spinach and feta. But in the 1960s, the classic plain croissant was the star. Rich, buttery, and slightly sweet, brioche is a French bread that slowly made its way into the American baking scene in the 1960s. Unlike more common bakery treats of the era, brioche wasn't necessarily found on every corner. Instead, it was seen as a special indulgence, perfect for those who wanted something a little more refined. The dough is made with a high proportion of butter, eggs, and milk, which gives brioche its characteristic rich, tender crumb. The process requires careful attention, mixing and kneading to ensure the dough becomes soft and pliable before it's left to rise. When baked, it develops a golden, slightly sweet crust. While the 1960s version of brioche was more traditional, it was often enjoyed as a breakfast treat or paired with coffee, making it a bit of a luxurious indulgence compared to the more everyday loaves Americans were used to. Today, brioche has become more accessible and versatile, appearing in everything from hamburgers, buns, to pastries. You might find it as part of gourmet sandwiches or even as a base for French toast. The popularity of brioche in the 60s coincided with a growing interest in European cuisine, bringing a touch of Parisian elegance to American tables. Originally a British classic, scones made their way across the ocean and became a quaint treat for tea parties in the United States during the 1960s. These slightly sweet, crumbly baked goods were a perfect accompaniment to tea, often served alongside jam and clotted cream, transporting American tea time to a more elegant setting. Made from simple ingredients like flour, butter, sugar, and milk or cream, scones have a dense yet tender texture. The dough is typically lightly mixed to avoid overworking, giving it a crumbly, flaky consistency once baked. In the 1960s, scones were usually round, occasionally studded with currants or raisins, or drizzled with a bit of icing. Nothing too fancy, just a comforting treat to go with your afternoon tea. Today, scones have evolved in flavor, with bakers experimenting with everything from chocolate chips to citrus zest, and even savory versions with cheese and herbs. In the 60s, however, the scone was a much simpler affair, reflecting the more traditional, understated aesthetic of the time. The rise of scones in the US during the 60s mirrored the growing fascination with British culture and tradition, with even TV shows like The Ed Sullivan Show helping to fuel the trend. Though shortbread cookies weren't necessarily a defining treat of the 1960s, they were certainly a classic favorite in many American households. This Scottish-born biscuit made its way to the States long before the 60s, but its buttery, melt-in-your-mouth simplicity made it a constant on many holiday tables, tea parties, and casual snacks throughout the decade. The ingredients are straightforward: flour, butter, and sugar, creating a cookie with a delicate, crumbly texture that's both rich and satisfying. The dough is often pressed into a pan and baked until lightly golden, allowing the flavors to develop without any distractions. In the 1960s, you'd often find shortbread in its most basic form, but sometimes it might have been jazzed up with a touch of vanilla or dipped in chocolate for a little extra indulgence. Fast forward to today, and shortbread cookies have become even more versatile. Bakers now add flavors like lemon zest, almonds, or even matcha to give them a modern twist. But in the 60s, the simplicity was the charm. No bells and whistles, just pure, buttery bliss. Chala, a traditional Jewish bread, may not have been a regular feature in every American bakery in the 1960s, but it certainly had its place in Jewish bakeries across the country, particularly on the Sabbath and for Jewish holidays like Rosh Hashanah. This slightly sweet braided bread carries a rich history, symbolizing the connection between culture and culinary tradition. Made from simple ingredients, flour, eggs, sugar, yeast, and oil, chala is known for its soft, fluffy texture and golden color, often achieved by brushing the dough with an egg wash before baking. The braiding technique, which can be as intricate as a 6-strand weave, gives the bread its distinctive appearance and texture. In the 1960s, it was primarily enjoyed by Jewish communities, and for many, it represented more than just a meal. It was a connection to heritage. Today, chala has gained a wider following, often appearing in non-Jewish households as well. It's popular for making French toast or simply served as a rich accompaniment to any meal. The 60s version was traditionally shaped in a round loaf for the holidays, while modern versions come in all shapes and sizes. Long, crusty loaves of French bread, or baguettes as they're known in their homeland, began making their way into American bakeries during the 1960s. Though it wasn't quite as ubiquitous as white or wheat bread, French bread started to gain popularity in certain circles, especially among those seeking a more sophisticated option for sandwiches or evening dinners. Traditionally made from just 4 ingredients: flour, water, yeast, and salt. French bread is characterized by its crisp, golden crust and chewy, airy interior. It's a bread that requires time and technique. The dough is often left to rise slowly, allowing the flavors to develop. The result was a loaf with a distinctive flavor and texture that can turn any meal into something more refined. While many Americans were still favoring the soft, pre-sliced loaves of the time, French bread was a sign of growing culinary curiosity and a desire for something new. By today's standards, French bread is a bakery staple in many homes, often used for everything from sandwiches to side dishes. But back in the 60s, it was more of a novelty, often reserved for special occasions. French bread was so special that it was often sliced and served in restaurants with butter or olive oil for dipping. A real touch of class, even if you were just eating it at home. Sugar cookies, simple, sweet, and a beloved classic in American baking, were a go-to treat for many households in the 1960s. Unlike the more complex pastries of the time, like eclairs or fruit tarts, sugar cookies kept it straightforward. Made with just sugar, butter, flour, eggs, and a hint of vanilla, they were the kind of cookie you could whip up in no time, perfect for an after-school snack or to serve at a family gathering. What made these cookies so special wasn't just the taste, but the versatility. They could be rolled into balls and sprinkled with sugar, cut into shapes for holidays, or even decorated with icing. Every batch a blank canvas for creativity. For many, sugar cookies evoke memories of childhood baking sessions, when the kitchen would be filled with the aroma of warm, freshly baked cookies and the laughter of family. While today's sugar cookies often come in intricate, themed shapes like gingerbread men or festive snowflakes, the version from the 1960s was typically more about simplicity, sometimes just a sprinkle of sugar on top. Still, these humble cookies held their own among the more extravagant desserts, offering comfort in every bite. When it came to reliable desserts in the 1960s, there was one cake that stood out for its simple elegance: pound cake. Made with equal parts butter, sugar, eggs, and flour, This dense, rich cake earned its place as a staple at family gatherings and special occasions. While not the flashiest option on the dessert table, pound cake's rich, buttery flavor and moist texture made it a crowd pleaser. The preparation was straightforward. Cream the butter and sugar, beat in the eggs, then fold in the flour. No fancy tricks, just solid baking techniques. And while it didn't have the colorful, layered appeal of other cakes, it often came adorned with powdered sugar or a glaze, giving it just the right touch of sweetness. Nostalgic for many, pound cake was the kind of dessert that could be served at a picnic, a birthday party, or alongside a cup of tea. It was a no-fuss favorite that, while not as extravagant as layered cakes or fruit-filled pies, still managed to steal the spotlight with its satisfying texture and timeless appeal. Today's pound cake often sees more variety. Flavors like lemon, chocolate, and almond now make their way into the mix, but the essence remains unchanged. In the 1960s, jelly rolls quietly claimed their place in American kitchens, offering an easy and comforting dessert. With their light, airy sponge cake filled with a generous swirl of fruit jelly, they weren't the trendiest dessert on the block, but they were a reliable favorite for many bakers. The preparation was simple. Whip up a sponge cake batter, bake it in a thin layer, then spread it with jelly or jam, roll it up carefully, and dust it with powdered sugar. No frills, no fuss, just a sweet, soft treat. The most common jelly used was raspberry or strawberry, but any fruit spread worked just fine. Nostalgic for many, the jelly roll was often a treat passed down through generations. It didn't have the flashy appeal of modern desserts, but it was the kind of cake you could count on. There was something charming about its simplicity. Today, while jelly rolls are less common, they have experienced a small revival, with more adventurous fillings like chocolate, whipped cream, or even Nutella. Some things, though, are best left unchanged, like the classic jelly roll, offering a bite of sweetness that always reminds us of home.
The Amish Yum Yum Salad is pretty much a creamy and incredibly rich, sweet salad made entirely out of fruits. It has a lot of its influences in the culture of the Amish, specifically around some areas in Pennsylvania where the Dutch communities are very prominent. It's similar to a lot of other dishes that are made from these cuisines as well. It makes a lot of use of what's available, and the idea here is basically to be very resourceful. Naturally though, the context these recipes find themselves in means that they have to adapt to the broader palate and trends of American eating. They kind of lose their traditional essence along the way, something that most Amish people tend to not like. Amish cooking makes a lot of use of canned fruit, whipped cream, and custard, and this recipe takes all of them to make a very interesting salad. It was pretty typical to serve this gelatin salad during family dinners, and the 60s were a time for jelly-based meals anyway.
Dandelion salad might sound like a fairy tale-like name for an incredibly frugal but delicious meal. By now, you might have noticed the scavenger vibe in terms of ingredients of the dishes so far. People making anything out of whatever they had on hand. Economic downturns often feature lifestyle changes, and the Great Depression was no other, sending people on a scramble to find and eat anything. Dandelion salad took scramble seriously as the meal involved finding and foraging dandelions. You would cut out all the roots, flowers, and waste to make the dressing for a very healthy salad. For people, especially those on a diet and a budget, this was a godsend. For a garnish, all people would usually put on it was lemon juice and olive oil, a dash of salt, and you were good to go at basically no cost. It was rare to get protein from actual meat during that period, but that didn't stop people from fulfilling their cravings by dabbling in mock cuisine, such as the popular mock fish fillet. While this did not actually use fish, it imitated the texture and flavor with pints of milk brought to boil, ground rice, chopped onion, and leeks, with the end being a good stir in a properly beaten egg. What you had was an excellent mimicry that felt close enough to the real thing while being distinct and offering a new experience. Nowadays, this recipe is used in vegan communities, but its origins come from very anti-vegan places, and it would be a great substitute for actual fish and chips as well.
Ground pork pasta is a pretty comforting dish that got really popular in the South. You might be surprised to hear this, but this is actually another piece of Italian culture. Ground pork has always been at the forefront of Italian cooking in America. They put pork sausages in their bolognese and make several pastas out of it too. A lot of the Italian way of cooking heavily involves a focus on garlic, wine reductions, and lots of herbs so that a flavorful base can be made for the dish. Italian immigrants would, in specific, spread around their many treasured pasta-making secrets when they first came over. They aren't the only group in America to really notice how well ground beef goes with pasta, though. A lot of Asian communities note the combination for pretty much the same reason. It works really well together, and plenty of low-budget, comforting recipes have been around it. This was a big part of home cooking in the 60s, and it was a great way to make use of some canned meat. If you had any leftover beef from a casserole or meatloaf, you could repurpose that too.
Vinegar pie is the rather odd dish on this list that proves that at times of desperation, anyone will eat anything. Vinegar pie started spreading infectiously out of states like Pennsylvania in the start of the 1930s and tops even dandelion salad when it comes to being budget-friendly. All you would need is an open crust, vinegar, sugar, and some eggs to create this unique pie. To cover the mediocre taste, people would coat the crust with a meringue. It was an affectionate treat to bring in case of a celebration and was easy to make if you had a sweet craving. The dish was also pretty delicious if you were able to get over the sour vinegar taste and focus on the meringue. People really wanted a sweet treat at the end of a hard week spent cutting corners and working long hours, and small joys like vinegar pies were what kept people sustained. Bubble and Squeak was something that completely fit the situations most people would find themselves in during the war, because this dish is all about the leftovers. Usually, Sunday dinner's leftovers would be used in a Bubble and Squeak to make sure nothing went to waste. Plus, people would definitely take that sentiment to heart when it came to holiday dinners where there were enough things left to constitute at least 2 or 3 meals the next day. Usually, this dish is made with potatoes and cabbage and is fried, so it goes properly and amazingly with some potato flotties or other items on the list. Maybe you can take a note from people's books the next time you think you have nothing to eat, but plenty of things still left.
Mushroom and leek salad is an old recipe that we can thank Europeans for. It's something that's always been really prominent in the many French, British, and Italian communities that are present in America. If you take a closer look at French culture, like a lot of Americans were doing during this point of the 20th century, you'll find that they've always played around with these two ingredients. The mushroom and leek salad in America doesn't exactly stick to any one kind of way of making the salad. It's got a little bit of everything, flavor, warmth, and a beautiful mixture of mushrooms that quenches what your heart craves. The French way is to emphasize the earthiness of the mushrooms, while the European way makes better use of the leek and dresses it up with vinegar and herbs. The Italian way sort of does both, and the American variant of the salad has regional differences depending on which area has more of which community.
Potato pancakes are one that we are very sad to have seen fade away from the arsenal of home chefs. Pancakes made with matzo or applesauce topped with garlic or fried onions made for such a mouth-watering meal. Low-income households back in those times were struggling to buy produce. Farmers' markets were uniformly unaffordable for middle-income households due to creeping inflation. People needed a vegetable that was cost-appropriate and easy to make in batches. Enter the potato pancake, which revolutionized the breakfast scene in a struggling time. As times improved, people slowly started going to more fancier and creative breakfasts, unfortunately leaving simpler dishes behind. Potato pancakes took a backseat in the face of changing food and economic trends, but anyone from the era will rave to you about the godsend these were. If people can make an entire fake fish fillet and still be pretty satisfied with it, then other meaty wonders like liver definitely are not too far off the horizon, and chopped liver substitute would eventually prove that right. Something that became incredibly popular in the war-torn landscape of America because all it took was some onions, green lentils, walnuts, and salt and pepper. You had to make a paste out of it to get the texture of chopped liver down, and in terms of taste, this was a completely new experience, yet a significantly cheaper and easier one. It was much easier to get ingredients like these than good quality liver back then, and a lot of citizens stuck with this recipe even after the dust settled because they liked how healthy of an alternative it was.
We're going to flip-flop between American ideas and French inspirations a lot in this list, so buckle up. Next up, we have beef Burgundy over noodles. This pretty much is ripped right out of the streets of Burgundy in France, and it's an offshoot of a classic and traditional French dish known as boeuf bourguignon. This was one of those high-end dishes you could order at upscale French restaurants meant to offer luxurious dining experiences. It wasn't really something you could make at home, but the taste was pretty irresistible. People definitely wanted more of it in their week-to-week eating plans, but they couldn't exactly keep up with the crater it was leaving in their wallets either. Well, one thing led to another, and a homemade version of it known as Burgundy over noodles came together. The dish used egg noodles instead of the traditional pastas that the French would use. It kept other things the same, such as using red wine to braise the beef. This recipe was common in cookbooks by Julia Child, who was also one of the few mainstream chefs who really vouched for this dish and tried to make it this nationwide hit. I think she pretty much achieved her goal there. You can find lots of references to this dish in cookbooks from the 60s, and I'm talking about the ones targeted at families like yours and mine.
Boiled carrot sandwiches was created from the weird culinary gap left by increasing prices and thinner savings accounts. Like we said, people wanted vegetables that ticked the cheaper and tastier most boxes for them. However, even that was getting tough. Some of the worst stretches of the Great Depression left people with frustrations and creativity alike. Whipping up dishes like this was common, and the boiled carrot sandwich definitely stayed during the time because of its simplicity. Americans love a good sandwich, and they adore an easy-to-cook filling. Boiled carrot sandwiches definitely met most of the criteria, as roasting cheese to create an open-faced sandwich was a popular choice. Suffering the same fate as other dishes on this list, the boiled carrot sandwich eventually died out as economic growth increased in America. Mock cuisine in general really saw its heyday during the harsh times of rationing, especially with all the things that were famously eaten before times got so bad, like brain. People wanted more of their favorites, even if they had to compromise in some way. And things like mock brains would become really popular as a result. Known for being quite heavy on the seasoning and being laced with fat, they incorporated basic spices like hickory smoke, paprika, and garlic. People would typically have it with a tomato sauce if they could spare the ingredients, and it definitely scratched that itch that lots of US meat lovers were having around the nation.
So the 60s wasn't just marked by us being nosy about other people and their long-standing food traditions. It was a time of culinary experimentation, if the gelatin salads didn't already make that clear for you. One of these Frankenstein-esque experiments was the Zucchini Hamburger Pie, which, yes, I know, that's a hard one to imagine. This pie is a quintessential mid-20th century banger, and it blends in the practicality of ingredients that typically make up a lot of grocery lists, like ground beef, and the variety that zucchini offers. The thing about zucchini is that it can work in a lot of different ways, which makes it really convenient. Funnily enough, that quality is exactly why it became as popular as it did during and right after the Second World War. This summer squash was suddenly one of the most cultivated crops around the nation, and its mild flavor made it a popular pick at most farmers' markets. It had its biggest market in the suburbs of the 60s, where lots of home cooks, moms, and grandmas relied on zucchini harvests for their show-stopping dishes. This combination of beef and zucchini in the form of a pie was definitely one of those main players in their roster. And it's a dish that, despite losing its relevance over the years, really made waves for how it explored some new ground in both the way you use a hamburger patty and what you can do with pie.
Prune pudding was one of the more niche dishes that were created during the Great Depression. What really was surprising was that prune pudding extended to the upper royalty as well, since even prominent VIPs would also be real low budget with how they eat. Prune pudding became very popular as a result of the efforts made by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who would serve prune pudding at White House functions. It stained the White House's culinary track record, sure, but earned massive points with the struggling American people. For being made of such a simple ingredient and some syrups of your choice, it was definitely one of the tastiest and cheapest meals to come home to. People that grew up during World War II will know that mixing sawdust with bread to fortify it so that your supply would last twice as long is not quite the urban myth it is made out to be today, but rather a sad fact of a dark time that people would prefer to leave in the past. This was something born purely out of necessity and a lack of basic necessities like flour. Since it was becoming so scarce across America, people's supplies of bread were running out fast and often. Bread was the only thing families had to eat too. With even that comfort gone, people took to mixing sawdust, which you could even taste in the bread. In some cases, it made the bread go bad faster, such as people when used too much of it. But in most other appliances of this technique, it worked as a filler when nothing else could be used as one. This would also set up a trend of consuming fiber in the 70s, even though most companies used cellulose fiber that was made from sawdust. So it actually does have quite a history in America.
The concept of a dill mushroom turnover was pretty much taken from the trend of pastries with really sweet fillings. It's not really anything new, but it is one of those food traditions that disappears and resurfaces every other decade. You have counterparts for these in all cultures, but today we're talking about how dill mushroom turnovers became such a cultural moment in America. In Pennsylvania, which was pretty much widely known for its incredible mushroom farming potential, advancements in farming techniques meant that it was a golden age for mushroom lovers. Dills, on the other hand, were slowly becoming more and more popular thanks to all the European immigrants coming over. Then you had cocktail culture. A lot of people were going to cocktail parties that basically featured appetizers and one-bite dishes. There was a bigger focus on digestible, light food instead of hearty, grand, and massive plates that could feed a whole family. You take all three of those changes, and what do you get? Tortillas, and they're an amazing choice for an entree.
Egg drop soup for some royal courts was a show of a chef's skill. In 1930, America, the soup became a beloved soup of the masses who were struggling to make an honest paycheck. Bread from last night and eggs beaten so thoroughly that the preparation itself doubled as a forearm workout resulted in an incredibly rich soup. Sometimes, if a home cook felt particularly fancy, they would have chicken either boiled or shredded in the mix. Using the chicken stock was also a common way to not let anything go to waste, since getting the most bang for your buck out of poultry became a habit of everyone. Most would just have this with eggs and throw in some ginger, chives and olives, or anchovies. We would definitely like to see this make a comeback with a less cost-oriented version that really explores the dish. So, for onions stuffed with grape nuts, you needed nothing that fancy, not even a lot of seasoning outside of your basic salt and pepper. All you needed was 1.5 cups of pork sausage meat, some melted fat, ketchup, and if you could spare some strips, then bacon. Of course, the key player, grape nuts, would come later when the onions would be chopped and diced mixed with the sausage and the other ingredients. This was then baked for around 40 minutes, and the outcome was a resounding yes from everyone at the dinner table. Dishes that were simple but incredibly effective at filling everyone and leaving them with a happy smile were the holy grail of the 40s and 50s.
Speaking of massive meals, chicken and wild rice casserole is a pretty good example. This is something that you typically see all over North America if you ever went, particularly in areas with a large Native American presence. It's because wild rice is such a big piece of their culture. It's known as manumin in Ojibwe, and it's pretty well known around the Great Lakes. Fun fact, they used to harvest wild rice by hand. Eventually, European settlers made it a mainstream part of people's diets, but that was in the 18th and 19th centuries. There were lots of reasons to be eating wild rice. It was nutritious, it was filling and affordable, and it worked really well with casseroles thanks to its inherently nutty notes. You have to understand one thing about the 60s and 50s as well. They were the first decades Americans had since the start of 1910 and the beginning and middle points of the 1920s. After that, it was just recession this, war that. People got really tired, and half the country was rediscovering their culinary spark, while the other half had sworn to pig out for the foreseeable future. And honestly, who could blame them?
Cabbage and noodles typically just looked like a pound of cabbage and a medium serving of noodles. More or less, it was not the most expensive dish, and you could enjoy a bowl by making it pretty quickly. Away from the pancake and pie-addled fanatics are admirers of noodles across the states. Everyone needs their cravings satisfied from time to time, even if the soaring prices spared no one. In some areas, cabbage and noodles was known as halusky. However, in most places, it was simply referred to as cabbage and noodles, the most typical Depression-era noodle recipe. It's a must-have that needed to be in your repertoire if you were to survive the times and not forget every taste you ever loved. Someone really needs to study how times like these bring out everyone's culinary creativity. Cottage cheese being used as a substitute for meat is another factor of cooking that you probably never thought was possible, but is actually well documented. Even the Department of Agriculture agrees that it is a pretty rocking substitute for meat as it contains a lot of protein. And when you need to get your macros in on a budget, you cannot be complaining about the source. Sure, everyone would love to fulfill their battle-action protagonist fantasies of chowing down trays and trays of meat, but we only need so many grams of protein in a day to make a bulk. Dry curd cottage cheese especially contains more protein per pound than beef or lamb, and only chicken and veal beat it at that game. It seems there is a lot of cooking know-how that can be picked up from Americans living in those times.
Surf and turf is a seafood and ground meat combination that really took the competition by storm in most coastal regions. It's not exactly a specific dish or recipe, but a style of dishes that have a massive focus on combining things like lobster and steak. Basically, if you're a meat lover of all kinds, this is the dish for you. Where did the surf and turf name come from then? This was pretty much just slang of the times. It was used to refer to bougie dining places and big events with their exotic catering needs. It was also supposed to represent the two core components of the dish. You had your seafood, the surf, and then you had your meats, the turf. Genius, I know. If you ever needed a knockout menu for a wedding or a big dinner, then you'd go for surf and turf places. So surf and turf isn't exactly its own genre of food either. It just refers to anything that puts seafood and red-white meat together. Lots of people think that the dish first came to life in North America, but a lot of people also think it was made in the West Coast. No one can really say who the first person was to do it. It was pretty common to serve this dish with comforting sides like asparagus and beans or mashed potatoes. A lot of places would use béarnaise sauces too.
Bean soup is different from the other soups on our list because, in contrast, bean soup was pretty simple to make. Dried red kidney beans in a thick soup made for a favorite of states like Idaho, where the dish originated from. You could find different ideas on the soup from house to house, as some had their vegetables as toppings and others had meats. Fred Dubois, who was Idaho's senator at one point, passed a bill that mandated the Senate restaurant to have bean soup on the menu every day. Definitely one way to start a movement if you ask us, but the trend definitely stuck around after it gained steam. It was an amazing way for low-income neighborhoods to eat healthy, but nowadays you would not find it in households as beans are not really the go-to item for soups. Ever thought you would have a cassie with no meat in it? An economy loaf is just that, and we could not have named it better if you put a gun to our head. Using potatoes, peas, flour, eggs, and some basic seasoning, this was a loaf made entirely of alternatives to meat, so for vegans it is a recipe to keep in mind throughout the ages. But in the rationing-ridden times of World War II, it was a godsend to have this quick and easy loaf. It was even popular enough to be in cookbooks like The Modern Hostess, even its special patriotic edition. Roosevelt's presidency really saw some gems, right?
Louise's lasagna was this adaptable lasagna recipe that did a lot of substituting and took advantage of the trends of the decade. Remember how we talked about the way people were really opening up to zucchini, and also how farming mushrooms was easier than it ever was? While we aren't sure who the first Louise to do it was, we do know that there were loads of people who made amazing use of both of those facts, and this lasagna is just one more testament to that statement. It basically substitutes a lot of typical lasagna ingredients. Normally, most Americans use cottage cheese in their lasagna. This time around, the dish asks for ricotta. You normally don't really see many vegetables in lasagnas either, but this time around, zucchini and mushrooms make a wonderful appearance as the B team for this dish. As far as the meats go, that area is pretty much the same. Lots of places had their own versions of spice blends and sauces that they'd save for this recipe. But the idea was basically to reinvent lasagnas with the trends of the times.
Milk toast is exactly what the name suggests. Toasted to perfection bread dipped in milk with a generous slap of butter. On days when any meal you loved was unaffordable and getting up to cook something proper was dreadful, milk toast came through for many families. All you needed was some good fresh bread and a warm glass of milk to gorge on until you felt full. Milk toast quickly became one of the most popular breakfasts in the States, catering specifically to people below the poverty line who could not make most of the items on this list regularly. Nowadays, this might be considered a very vintage meal, the type to get kids asking you what century you might be from. But back then, it was something even working-class 20-year-olds would eat daily. Times have changed, and the breakfast of people in those socioeconomic classes is definitely different. Shortages were extremely common right up to before Pearl Harbor, and especially after it. This is what led to things like Walton Pie dominating the mainstream, even though the dish would probably not see the light of day in normal circumstances. It is just that things like pies, loaves, pizzas, etc. had all become unattainable desires that were out of the public's grasp, more or less. Something had to be done, though, because not only did people need to be fed, they needed to be reminded of why eating good food is one of life's best joys. A hot, nice meal can do so much for a person's soul in times of conflict and uncertainty. And Walton pies, despite being made entirely out of vegetables, not only gave your body the health boost it needed, but they felt comforting to share with your family.
Spaghetti Dible is pretty much a pasta dish that's known for not being forgiving. Some dishes tend to be approachable. You feel like they're inviting you to try them, and they look irresistible too. Not this Dible, not in any way at all. It looks like your typical plate of pasta, although with a lot of warm colors, but it tastes like it's trying to hurt you. This spaghetti is known entirely for its devilish heat, which has sent more than a few people to the counter asking for a glass of milk. It's not really the chili that does it this time. It's the black pepper. This pasta dish is known entirely for how spicy it can get, but the American version is actually a lot tamer. If you were making the original, authentic Italian version of the dish, which some communities and restaurants did, you'd be tackling an entirely different beast. On top of the black pepper and chili, you also have red pepper flakes and cayenne pepper in the sauce. So yeah, don't try this if you wouldn't bet money on your spice tolerance. I know I'd lose that bet, so I steer a little clear from dishes like these. But spicy variations of typical dishes like spaghetti were actually getting more and more popular throughout the 60s.
Creamed chipped beef on toast, however, was a more happening kind of toast-based breakfast. Particularly fancy and skillful home cooks would smoke the meat sometimes to add a better BBQ flavor. Thin slices of beef in glass jars were all you needed, which were not too expensive, and the rest of the dish was completed with a creamy, thick white sauce. Meat lovers would use cayenne pepper, remembering days where they could spray it on their steaks instead of their toast. Comfort food was really lacking in the Depression times because most could not make theirs. Creamed chipped beef on toast was a wonderful replacement that we are still sad to see fade away to history. Depending on where you were, the dish was more rare because you would most often see it in middle to upper middle class households. Beef really was expensive back then, but nowadays lots of other beef-based breakfasts took its spot. There is nothing like taking advantage of nature's bounty with sweet dishes like apple brown betties, and if the subject is how a pie can put you in the right mood, then it is criminal not to talk about these. Usually made with apples or pears, berries, and other seasonal common fruit, the fruit would be baked, and layers of sweetened crumbs would hold it all together. The dish was the textbook definition of comfort food, and it screamed grandma's cooking in a time where many people did not know if they would see their family again. Lots of folks were suffering from malnutrition and hunger, but pies like this, which are easy to make with natural ingredients, were a blessing. Apple brown betties are not as widely consumed today as they were during the World War, but back in the day, people found solace in the dessert they could make with whatever little they had. The recipe is commendable and might taste weird to us today because of our modern tastes.
There was another trend that was pretty much unique to the middle of the 20th century, which was a turning point for a lot of things. Chicken salad pie was one of the examples of how America was really trying to take its commitment to healthy eating just a bit more seriously for once. You'll notice that every time the status quo tries to change to something else in America with regard to food, it always has to start off with something familiar, Like, for example, chicken salad pie does involve a salad, but it gives it to you in the form of a pie, which is infinitely familiar. Pineapples have to be served on pizza and with ham for them to be noticed. And even then, the discourse on whether or not it's food blasphemy never stops. This chilled salad was just as divisive, with a lot of people thinking that salads have no place in pies. Chicken salads have been around as early as the 20th century, though, and it doesn't seem like they have any intention of leaving. This pie was an everyday meal you could make and also use as an excuse to get just a few more greens into your family's diet, which is something Americans really could use a lot more of.
If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment down below telling us which one of these freshly baked goods would you like to try, in the old 60s way.